And Luke, numbers count in the Bible. Luke, the 8th chapter, he said Jesus fed 4,000 with 7 loaves of broken bread, 7 and 4. Any number that's multiplied by 10, 100, 1,000 is a form of the original number. You're going to find 4 and 7 all through the Bible. For 510 years, Israel went after Baal and the groves. The grove was the same thing as Venus, Aphrodite. All the female deities were represented as tree goddesses. That was the grove, was Asherah, means an upright goddess. Means an upright goddess. Baal was the same thing as Hercules or Jupiter or any of these other gods. They called all of their gods in the ancient world by the title of D-A-I-M-O-N-I-O-N. Oh, that's that. Daimonion is our word demon. Demons are not real. Demons were the gods of the ancient world. And that's what Israel worshiped: Baal, Grove, Shemash, Molech, all the gods of the people around them. And for that, the reason they did that, they didn't like the laws of God. The laws of God. Particularly, there was one law that they were just adamantly against, and that was the law of the sabbatical year. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Every 7 years, God says, and he tells them this in Leviticus, the 25th chapter, 25. You have to let the land lie fallow every 7 years. They said, we don't like that. Well, that's tough. That is in the place of what we would call crop rotation. You cannot just grow fields every year of the same thing, crop rotation. In the Midwest, you go out to Kansas, you go out to Iowa, the farmers out there, if these big farmers, if they have several thousand acres that they're planting, they can't plant the same thing every year. If they do, it will suck all the nutrients out of the ground. The nutrients. That's what makes things grow. Nutrients. Makes the crops grow. In fact, I had a guy that came here, he had a degree in biology, and he said snow is an absolute necessity for those farmers out there because it has nitrogen in it. And he said nitrogen is a necessity for crops to grow in these fields. Well, with the snow not snowing like it used to, especially in our area, even up in Wisconsin where the Doyles live, they said it doesn't snow up there like it used to. It doesn't snow in the Midwest. Therefore, this is going to cause crop devastation or famine to some degree. So instead of having crop rotation, I don't know how that works. They have to call a farm agent out. Farm agent every so many months to check the soil. This is environmentalist. It's an environmentalist that comes out, takes a sample of the soil, takes it back to his office, has it checked out. I used to have to do that as a real estate agent. Whenever I would sell a house that had a septic system, they'd have some, I'd have to call the agent up there in Gallatin. He'd have to come out, take a sample of the soil, and see if the soil would perk, if it would saturate the septic system. And otherwise, you couldn't sell the house if it didn't have a clear health letter on it. Well, that's the same thing as this right here. Instead of explaining to the people, you can't suck all the nutrients out of the ground, you have to stop and let the land lie fallow. You can't plant, and you cannot take anything from the crop every 7 years. That's one of the big reasons that They said, we'll go after other gods that'll let us do what we want to do. When you get to Hosea, the second chapter, the Bible says that they wanted to give credit, Israel wanted to give credit to their lovers, and they called idol worship, they called that their lovers. Idolatry, that was their lovers, and they wanted to give their lovers credit for their grain, their oil, and all the rest of their crops, their wheat, their corn, and they were giving that credit to their lovers. That way their lovers, or the gods, or Baal, didn't require a sabbatical year. But just stop and think. After 490 years of not keeping the sabbatical year, can you imagine how drained the land of Israel was by the time God says, I'm going to carry you into captivity. But when I carry you away, it's not going to be to destroy you by Babylon and by Assyria. It's so you can stay there until the land has enjoyed her Sabbaths. In fact, let me show you that. I'll go back to Leviticus 25, but let me show you this. Go here to 2 Chronicles, the 36th chapter. In 2 Chronicles, the 36th chapter, this is where Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, or the king of the beast, he comes in and he carries Israel away. Look here. And sometimes I don't even know where to start with this. My mind's going to 100 places. So I just stop in the middle of it and say, let me show you this. Look here in 2 Chronicles, the 36th chapter. Nebuchadnezzar is coming in. This is in 586 BC. You say, why those dates? You need to know that was the last deportation. That was a military destruction of Jerusalem, of Israel. And God had Nebuchadnezzar come in, level the temple, level the city, burn it all to the ground. They would always sow it, plow it up with a plow and sow the salt. So in a matter of months, Israel looked like a wasted land. And here this is Nebuchadnezzar coming in to carry southern Judah away into captivity. Look in verse 17. Therefore he brought upon them, upon Israel. Let me read 16. Israel mocked the messengers of God. They mocked Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all of the prophets of God that went in to tell them judgment's coming from the east. Nebuchadnezzar's on the way, and he's going to level this place. That's what Jeremiah was telling them. And they mocked the messengers of God and despised his words and misused his prophets. They misused Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all the rest of those super prophets like Elisha and Elijah, and they wanted to kill them because they were hurting them by making them tell them, you better keep these sabbatical years until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy. There's no remedy. Marpe is the word remedy. It means no cure. Marpe. There was no cure. There's no cure for the judgment of God. There's no cure for sword, famine, pestilence, and the beast. Well, Nebuchadnezzar is the head of the beast world system here. He had no compassion upon young man or maiden, old man or him that stooped for age. Didn't have any compassion on anybody. He says, I will not pity. I wrote a paper on that. I will not pity. He gave them all into his hand, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. And all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, all of the snuffers, all of the pans that they dipped coal with, all of the candles, everything that they needed, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king and his princes, all of these he brought to Babylon. Babylon was about 650 miles away from Jerusalem. You had to go up north, go around this way, because all this was Arabian desert down there. And they burned the house of God. They burned the temple. and brake down the wall of Jerusalem, and burnt all the palaces thereof with fire, and destroyed all the goodly vessels thereof. And them that had escaped the sword carried he away to Babylon, where they were servants to him or to Nebuchadnezzar and his sons, until the reign of the king of Persia. So you're going to jump from verse 20 to go down here to verse 22. You're going to jump from 586 to 539 BC. That's when the Persian king comes in, overthrows Babylon. Then he says, then them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon. Those that tried to resist, he killed them, millions of them, where they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. Persia was what we call Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq. All of that was, not Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, all the stands was Persia. And here's what they were carried away for: to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. That's the reason. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, the sabbatical years, to fulfill 60. A score is 20, 60 is 60, and 10 years. That's 70 years. They never kept their sabbatical years. That's it. That's the main reason. Now let me show you. Go back over here to Leviticus, the 26th chapter. Leviticus 26. Now Leviticus 25 gives the sabbatical years. Let me give you this, and then I'll go back and look at the sabbatical years. This is the main reason that they went after other gods. The other gods wouldn't require Sabbath.
Thank you, Roland. Have a very good day.
Reap something we planted. They planted in the 6th year, but they weren't allowed to reap it in the 7th year. They had winter crops they planted that they would reap come the spring of the 7th year, but they weren't allowed to reap it. They planted in the 7th year. Only the poor, the needy, and the cattle and the animals could go out there in the field and take it. Then he says here in Leviticus 26, and he says here, 26 and 33, I will scatter you among the heathen. That's what he's doing in the 36th chapter. And will draw out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities will be waste. After Nebuchadnezzar came in, Israel and Jerusalem looked like a wasteland. Most people don't know there was a captivity, and that captivity lasted from when Nebuchadnezzar carried Israel away. It has lasted 2,600 years. From the carrying away until May 14th, 1948, they were scattered. They were under the siege of the sword. Siege of the sword. War has been against Israel from 586 to May 14th, 1948, and particularly the Six-Day War of 1967. In the 67 war, Jerusalem was being ruled before that by the Jordanians. Jordan is just east of Israel. That's Jordan. Jordan is the land of Moab and Ammon. Let me go over here, see if I can find Jordan. All right. Jordan here. Let's look at Jordan. No, I don't have a Jordan that goes by. Jordan is right. Here's Israel. This is Jordan right over here. This is Moab. Ammon is right up here. So that is Israel, Moab, and Ammon, which is Jordan. Now, where was I? 34. Then shall the land enjoy, when I scatter you, then will the land enjoy her Sabbaths, as long as it lieth desolate. God's plan was not to have them, what it was. I started to say it wasn't to have them scattered for 2,600 years. He had an immediate plan. He said, I'm going to put you over in Babylon for 70 years. And you'll be in Babylon for 70 years till the land, if you leave the land alone for 70 years, the nutrients will begin to restore in the land. Then I can bring you back to Israel from Babylon after it has sat there and restored the nutrients. So God planned for Israel not to listen to him when the 4 decrees were given to go back and rebuild the temple and to rebuild the city. There were 4 decrees. The first 3 was about the temple. That was in Ezra, the first chapter. Ezra, the 6th and the 7th chapter. That's the first 3 decrees. The decree to rebuild the city was in Nehemiah, the 2nd chapter. Nehemiah and Ezra were compadres. They were friends. Then he says, then shall the land enjoy Sabbath as long as it lay desolate. Ye be in your enemy's land, even then shall the land rest. The land has to rest, and you have not left it alone. That's what made them go after other gods. The other gods wouldn't require nothing. Of course, they weren't real gods either. They set the standard themselves. And enjoy her Sabbaths. Now you can remember, just reverse 34 to 43. Look up at verse 43. The land also shall be left of them, and shall enjoy her Sabbaths, while she lieth desolate without them, and they shall accept the punishment of their iniquity when they're carried away into Babylon. Because they despised my judgments, and because their soul abhorred my statutes, they have despised me when I told them, here's the program. God is not going to stop and teach them crop rotation. He's just going to say, leave the land alone every 7 years. And they say, why? He said, because I said so. He's not going to tell them why. He's not going to say, you'll burn the land up. It'll just, after they were there for 500 years or 490 years, never keeping Sabbath, I don't know which ones are the kings. I'm sure once there were 3 righteous kings in Israel. There was David, who was a righteous king. There were 2 other righteous kings. Does anybody know who they were? Hezekiah and Josiah, that's right. Hezekiah and Josiah were the 2. So among these other kings, most of them did not keep the sabbatical years for 490 years. Now, what is that about? Let's back up to the 25th chapter. 25th chapter, Leviticus, is one of the most important chapters in the Bible. It's telling you about the sabbatical years. It was out of their greed, said, we ain't going to stop harvesting in that 7th year. Well, you keep on planting and keep harvesting every 7th year. By the time they get 400 years down the road, they'll be like me and Mary planting that garden one time that we planted every year for 10 years. And we go out and buy jumbo tomatoes, and they end up being little bitty cherry tomatoes about that big. Because we had sucked all the nutrients out of the ground. You can't plant that way. That's what Israel did. They said, we don't care, we want our crops. God had told them, if you keep my statutes and my commandments, of which the sabbatical years was one of the commandments, all you have to do is keep my commandments, and I'll overflow your storehouse, your basket. When you go out together, it'll be full. You'll have more in the 7th year than you'll have otherwise. You'll have more than you need. Well, here in the 25th chapter, it tells you all about the sabbatical year. Let's read it. This is one of the main reasons, this chapter, why all this prophecy is taking place. The Lord spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when you come into the land, when you get into the land of Israel, here's one of the rules you got to keep. They're in the wilderness here in Leviticus. They're still at Kadesh Barnea here. When you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years shalt thou sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land. A Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field, nor prune thy vineyard. That which groweth of its own accord of thy harvest, what is growing, you can't go out there and get it. Thou shalt not reap, neither gather the grapes of thy vine undressed, for it is the year of rest unto the land. And the Sabbath of the land shall be meat for you, for thee, and for thy servant, and for thy maid, and for thy hired servant, and for the stranger that sojourneth with you. Whatever is growing out there, you leave it alone. It's for the servants, it's for the hired people, it's for the animals, and for the cattle, and for the beasts that are in the land, shall all the increase thereof be for meat. And thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years, and the space of 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. That's the Day of Atonement. In the Day of Atonement, you shall make the trumpet sound throughout all the land, and you shall hallow the 50th year, that is the year of Jubilee, and proclaim liberty through all the land. Now, every 50 years, here's what they had to do in this year of Jubilee. You had to proclaim liberty, and the inhabitants thereof, it shall be a jubilee unto you, and ye shall return every man unto his possession. If you have a man and he's a bond servant, okay, that ain't right. If a man is a bond servant, and he's working out a debt he owes to the owner of the land, and he has to go into that owner's house and become a slave to that owner. A slave back in that day and time was not what we call a slave. Being a slave was fantastic. You went into a big landowner's house, you tried to work out your debt to him, and if you were a bondservant for, let's say, 7 years, and you're only 2 years into it, come the 50th year, if the 50th year comes there, he's got to forgive you all of that debt that he owes, and you go back home, and everybody goes back home, starts over again at square one. Nobody passes go, and nobody collects $200. Nobody. Debts are canceled in the 50th year. They said, we ain't going to do that either, Moses. You're out of your mind. And you shall return every man his possession. You will return every man unto his family. And he's no longer a servant, and he no longer owes anything. That's the way God controlled greed. And all lands went back to the original owners. That stopped big land grabbers, landowners all over Israel. A jubilee shall be in that 50th year unto you, and you shall not sow, neither reap that which groweth of itself in it, nor gather the grapes in it of thy vine undressed. For it is the jubilee, and it shall be holy unto you, and you shall eat the increase thereof of the field. In the year of this jubilee ye shall return every man unto his possession. If you've bought all kinds of land and you're a hustling guy and you can go out there and do a lot of business and own a bunch of property, every 50th year you don't own nothing anymore except your original land. That's it. They said, we ain't going to do that. You're nuts, Moses. But that was God's law. That's how he controlled these things. So when you get over here and Israel keeps for 490 of these, from 1 Samuel to 2 Chronicles, which is the history of Israel in the Old Testament, 2 Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Kings and Chronicles, that's called the Book of the Kings. It's one book among the Jews, the Book of the Kings, and all that time was about 510 years. 490 of those years, 70 sets of these. God says, I'm going to carry you into Babylon, and after 70 years, and the land has enjoyed its Sabbaths, I'm going to bring you back with these decrees of these Persian kings. I'll have the Persians. It's amazing that only Persian kings gave these decrees, and they sounded like believers, Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, because God stirred in their hearts to let Israel go back and possess their land after 70 years. After 70 years, see, the whole idea, you're going to go over here, I'm going to have Nebuchadnezzar come in, carry you to Babylon, and then I'm going to have these decrees given, 1, 2, 3, 4, and these are going to be given by Persian kings. Because Persia is going to overthrow Babylon in 539 BC. The first decree will be in 538 to rebuild the temple. That'll be given by Darius. Temple, Darius, D-A-R-I-U-S. And the second decree, not Darius, excuse me, Cyrus. Cyrus, that's the last verses of 2nd Chronicles, the 36th chapter, and the first 3 or 4 verses of Ezra, the very next page. Ezra, the first chapter. Ezra, the first chapter. He gives that twice. He gives 2 witnesses to that decree. And then the second decree is in 520. And Darius is the king. And Cyrus has been long dead at this time, Darius. And that's given in Ezra, the 6th chapter. This is amazing. I've never heard anybody teach on the book of Ezra. And that's where these decrees were given for Israel to go back and rebuild their temple and their city. I never heard anybody even talk about it. I have never heard anybody preach in my life. And I've heard hundreds and hundreds of preachers. I've never heard any preacher preach on the 70 weeks of Daniel. I'm the only preacher I know of, and I do it thoroughly. You're hearing stuff you won't hear in any church in the country. The only people that studied are professors in seminaries. Nobody else studies it. I've been studying the 70 weeks of Daniel since 1964. and I did one series on it, 18 months on Sunday morning, and I didn't even finish it. You don't really finish it. And then the third decree was given. This was Ezra 6. This is Ezra 1. And the third decree was given by Artaxerxes. Let me write it down. In 457, could be 56, it's just no matter who you're reading. And that was given, that third decree, this is the third decree, given by Artaxerxes, Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes, that was the third decree. These three decrees were given concerning the temple. The third decree to supply the temple with all the extras that the priests need, and they needed more priests over there, so they sent a lot back. And they did that by Ezra. Ezra took that decree himself, and that was in Ezra the 7th chapter. And the fourth decree, let's kind of put it over here. The fourth decree was in Nehemiah the 2nd chapter. And that was to rebuild the city, Jerusalem. All of this had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar when he went over there to carry Israel away. So that's the fourth decree. When he goes to Artaxerxes, we'll call him Art, and Artaxerxes said, "You look sad, Nehemiah. What's wrong?" He said, "My city is burned to the ground. Could I have decrees to go back and rebuild the city?" And Artaxerxes gave him a letter with his signature on it, and that was law. So Nehemiah went back. He was gone for 12 years until around 332 BC. That's about when he finished it. He finished the city, and Israel but during this first decree, less than 50,000 Jews came back. They didn't ever really, they went back, a certain few faithful Jews went back and rebuilt these things that they were supposed to do. But most of the Jews stayed in Babylon because they began to be free over there and started gathering lots of land and houses and stuff and got rich over there in Babylon. They said, "We don't want to go back." Anytime you find, like in Isaiah 40, when the Bible says, "Prepare you a highway in the desert for the Lord, make straight his paths," it's talking about Israel making a path to come back to Israel to rebuild the temple and the city. Because they never really wanted to come back. Look over in Ezra. I don't know how I wander off on this, but look in Ezra, the 2nd chapter. Ezra's really interesting. Ezra, the 2nd chapter. Ezra, Nehemiah, Job, Ezra, the 2nd chapter. Now there were millions of Jews over in Babylon. In Ezra, the 2nd chapter, down here in verse 64, the whole congregation together that came back in this first decree was 42,303 score. It was 42,360. That isn't many people to have millions over in Babylon. They didn't want to come back. And so God says, if you don't come back, what I'm going to do, I'm going to measure out to you these 7